आप कुछ कहना चाहेंगे इस बारे में? आपका फर्स्ट कंपाइलेशन है
Uh,
इतने पोएम्स का। और
देखिए, I've been writing poetry ever since my college time,
यस।
and I used to write a lot of poems. And the problem with me was that I was not very organized. I have lost a lot of my poems which I had written, which I had scribbled somewhere. My mother used to find sometimes पहले टेलीफोन डायरेक्टरी होती थी, उसमें पोएम निकल रही है, कहीं कोने पे पड़ी है. So she used to say, ये
जी।
क्या है? Why don't you compile your poems in one place?
यस।
So most of my poems published in this anthology, let me tell you, are published poems. I used to
ओके।
contribute poetry to different magazines and poetry journals, and
ओके।
90% of these poems, of these 46 poems, at least 38 of them are already published poems in what were once upon a time very popular and important magazines like the Illustrated Weekly of India, like the
यस।
Femina, the Youth
वाओ।
Times, and एक मैगजीन आपको पता नहीं नाम ध्यान होगा कि नहीं, जेएस होता था एक मैगजीन, जूनियर
ओके।
स्टेट्समैन होता था, उसका नाम बाद में जेएस हो गया था.
ओके।
So all my poems, other than that, there were poetry journals like Litcrit, Indian Scholar, उसमें वहाँ छपी हुई poems हैं. And the poetry editors of these magazines were well-known Indo-Anglian poets like Nissim Sekal, Shiv K. Kumar, Kamla Das, K.N.
Wow, all the
Daruwala.
big
All
names,
these were
all very
well-known
reputed
writers.
names. Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is that these are published poems selected by these poetry editors to appear in those magazines.
Hmm. True. So I can see, very wide variety of variety in your poems, right? So how did you cover such a huge landscape in this book or in these
See,
poems?
my first poem in this anthology was written and published in 1976. So from
Oh,
1976 to now, I used to keep a diary where I used to scribble poems, and I take a lot of time in, if I've done my first draft, then I take a lot of time in compiling my poems, and in other words, revising my poems, I would say, not compiling. I take a lot of time in revising my poems. So, excuse me, Pinky, I'm getting that. Yeah. Yeah. So over the years, my each poem needs revision. I can't just write a poem and say it's ready for publication. So each poem gets revised a number of times, and the final product is very different.
So you mean to say you have covered all these topics, या जो भी हम बोल सकते हैं, जिन जिन
So yeah, you are right
फीलिंग्स को आपने
that
छुआ है तो over the years.
there are a wide variety of topics, ranging from anything, like there is a poem on the demolition of Babri Masjid. There are love poems. Then there are poems relating to, not having been able to achieve much in life. All right. In fact, my Epitaph, the title poem, it's not a death poem, as many believe. It is actually a poem relating to someone not having achieved much in life. You realize that so many years have gone by, and what have you done in your life?
Yes.
So that's it. Then there is a poem about a Holocaust survivor, Auschwitz survivor. There is a poem relating to the felling of trees, environment. And so you're true that it has a huge, one section of my poems that I'm very proud of are, there are poems like written on literary personas, like Hamlet, like Usarian. Usarian is the central figure of the novel Catch-22. There is one
Mm-hmm.
on Hemingway, and there is one on the well-known poet Sylvia Plath. So I think these poems are, feel very good about them.
Mm-hmm. Truly. And you have written all of them so beautifully, and the expression, and especially in you have chosen such words in very simple and very few words. You have said very deep things. So that's the most commendable part about this book, I must say.
Yeah, so let me tell you that gauntness, there's a word called gauntness or brevity. Most of my poems have been revised so often that there will not be a single word which is superfluous in the poem.
Mm.
A poet has to ultimately choose his words, even his, punctuation marks, even a comma and a
Yes,
full stop
yes,
or a
truly.
parenthesis can make a difference. So a poet
Bilkul.
chooses his words like a jeweler chooses the stones, the precious
Mm-hmm.
stones to put in the jewelry. The manner in
So
which he
true.
picks and keeps it, that's the way a poet selects a word. And for
Mm.
that, you need constant revision. You can't just write a poem and say it's ready for publication or it's ready to go on an online poetry portal. No, it's not. It has
Mm.
to be revised. A poet always reads his poems out loud when he's alone, and he
Mm.
gets to know the rhythm that it's coming out right.
Yes, yes,
That's the
true.
time you feel that a poem is ready to be shared with people.
Hmm. That's true. Absolutely correct. So one thing which I was, quite curious about knowing this, Jags, the title of this book. You have kept the title as My Epitaph, and this sounds like a very negative title. So how did you choose this title, and how did you, make sure that this is going to be the title of the book? Because this sounds a bit negative.
Yeah, so my epitaph is normally written on a tombstone when a
Mm,
person is
yes,
buried, that what did he
yes,
do in life or what kind of a person he was.
correct.
So, like I told you just now, my epitaph is not actually a death poem. It's a
Mm,
poem which says that one has not achieved anything in life. And I felt that the entire volume actually is what I have done. All this volume of poems, if you look at it in another manner, uh, well, this is my achievement. My first poem is
mm,
Epitaph, but I have compiled my 46 poems. It also gives
mm.
another level to the
Yes, so
thing.
it has a
But
contradictory
it's, I
expression
don't
as
think it's
well.
a
Yeah,
negative poem. But
yeah.
since you have brought up this topic of negativity,
Mm,
let me please tell you that most of my poems are, they are not light verse. They are not
mm,
limericks or doggerel. They would actually come in the category of dark poems. You
mm.
know.
True, that I've seen. Yeah, and one more thing, that most of the poems are in free verse. Like almost all of the poems are in free verse. So haven't you tried to write a poem in rhyme or something?
So all the modern poets are the ones which began in the latter part of the 20th century, and now the
Mm,
modern and contemporary poets all write in free verse. Those times have gone when we used to rhyme our verses. But why did free verse start? Because the rhyming or the particular pattern of putting a stanza was
mm,
putting a break on a lot of journalists. Because if you, I mean, sorry, a lot of poets. Because if you can't rhyme, then your emotion cannot be conveyed. So
mm,
free verse means you need not rhyme your poems,
mm,
and but at the same time, that does not mean that you can break all laws regarding writing a poem. The
mm,
basic, even if it is not rhyming, the basic rhythm of that poem has to be there. And in free verse, we use a large number of literary devices.
mm.
There can be alliteration, there can be repetition of a line, there
Yeah,
can be
yeah.
devices like onomatopoeia, which is
Mm,
a similar sounding word, and then there are
exactly.
similes, there are metaphors.
Mm, mm,
So symbolism, imagery, all these
yeah.
literary devices are there that we use in these poems. Even in the poem like my epitaph,
Mm,
which is a very short poem, Now, there's
Yes.
a repetition of line and there's a very strong symbol. The poem begins with, "On a cold, hard stone have I
Hmm.
engraved my own epitaph." On a cold, hard stone, everyone knows that the tombstone is cold and hard,
Hmm. Hmm.
but the cold, hard stone here symbolizes the difficulties in life. And if you
Yes.
see that the poem, "On a cold, hard stone have I engraved my own epitaph," here lies a bum who thought he'd do something in life. All he did was to write his own
His own
epitaph
epitaph.
on a cold, hard
Cold and
stone.
hard
The
stone.
last
Yeah.
repetition of line, if you
Yes.
remove the
Yes.
last line, if the
Hmm.
line does not get repeated, the poem is not worth anything.
Yeah. And the impact
So,
diminishes. That's also a part.
you have, when you read out loud to yourself
Hmm.
while
Hmm.
writing poetry, then you get to know what is sounding right, whether the rhythm is coming on right. So, poem should end where the reader or person who's listening feels that, oh, well, if it doesn't
Hmm.
end well. So, if I had not used the last line in my
Yes.
Epitaph poem was published in Femina, selected by Kamala Das. I'm particularly
Wow.
very proud of
Wow.
this poem. Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing. So coming to that, Jax, I would love to know that what are your favorite poems from this book, and which poems you are fond of? Can you recite a few of them for our audience?
Uh, you see, for a poet, all his poems are like his children, and
Yes,
it
I
would be
know.
difficult to just choose one. However, uh, there are two kinds of poems which a poet writes. One is a subjective poem, and one is the objective poem.
Hmm.
So I have written both subjective and objective poems. One special feature of my poems are that uh, I've also written on the craft of writing poetry. You know,
Ah.
so there are a lot of poems in my 4 or 5 poems, which is
Hmm.
on the struggle of the poet to write. So
Wow.
one of the poems, one of my poems which I wrote in mid 70s is "I Forget, I Forgive," which is a very subjective poem. It relates to your personal feelings. The other are objective poems like the one I've written on, say, Hamlet. I've compared Hamlet with the Nike tagline, "Just do it." Hamlet was
Hmm.
always dithering. He could not to be or not to be. He could not
Hmm.
act. Where you have a Nike tagline which says that you kind of just do it now.
Yeah.
Don't think about it. So I've juxtaposed both these situations in my
Hmm.
poem, and I think. But if you want me to read out a poem, I can.
Yes,
You want
please,
me to?
please. Our
Okay.
audience would also love that. Yeah.
Okay. So this is, I think, a very remarkable poem. It's about life. It's
Hmm.
figuring out. As we get closer to our end of lives, we suddenly start realizing what was it all about?
Hmm.
Why did we come here? What are we doing? Why are we running around? And so there's this poem called, I've just opened casually on any
Yeah,
page.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No worries.
So this is called Figuring Out.
Hmm.
Figuring out means that we are trying to figure out what this life is all about. It's okay if you can't figure out what's it all about. Most of us too can't figure out. If one threw in some clues, however, as if life is a crossword, it could boil down to, well, the killing of songs.
Hmm.
It could also be about cleansing yourself of quintessential goodness, about losing the very spirit of fighting the good fight. Most of all, it could be about pain, pure unalloyed pain. Take courage, for even he can't figure out what's it all about. He, I have written in capital letters here, signifying
Yes.
that it's God. That
God,
even
yeah.
God doesn't know what's it all about. What are
Yes.
we people talking about? So this is
Amazing,
one
amazing.
on. This is on writing a poem. This is a little long poem. I have written in the bracket with apologies to T.S. Eliot. T.S.
Mm,
Eliot is my most favorite poet, and his
mm,
poem "The Wasteland" is my most favorite poem. And
wow.
I've written, so it goes like this. Eliot would tell us how you're going to write. Adjectives, they say, are the potbelly of poetry. So I want to make my poems smart and taut with verbs and nouns. But first, I have to invoke the muse. So I call upon Thomas Stearns Eliot, a good guy, married his secretary in her 20s at the age of 60 plus. Also a great poet, wrote about cats and all, and society women pretending to know about Michelangelo. And oh yes, some poem called The Wasteland.
Mm,
Depressing name this. So here goes my first line in the true Elitic style. There is something rotten in the mighty Ganges. Ooh, what meaning? What symbolism? What whatever? I dream about the Hottenton. All I need now is to develop the rhythm. Taut is the key word. And meaning. Of course, the meaning. I play around with 1,000 ideas, but to no avail. It remains as elusive as the Holy Grail. What? My poem fogs your perception? Well, let it. I couldn't care less. A poem, damn it, doesn't have to mean. It just has to be. So
mm.
this is
Beautiful. Yeah.
it's on Eliot. So you will find in this poem now, if you there is this thing I would like to talk about my poetry that if you read The Wasteland of Eliot,
Mm-hmm.
so if you are not well versed with the biblical symbolism, like
Mm,
if you're not well versed with the Bible, if you're not well versed with the Upanishads, the Vedanta. So in one
mm,
poem, Wasteland, Eliot has written so much, but if to understand his poem, you have to know
mm.
all these
Yeah,
things
that's true.
to really
Yes.
appreciate his poetry. He alludes so much, allusion is so much to different sources.
Yes.
So I think even in my collection of poems, if someone has not read the novel Catch 22,
Mm,
how will he understand what Usarian is all about? There's a poem
that's true.
entitled
Yeah.
Usarian. If someone
Mm,
has not read Hamlet, how
mm.
will he know what this poem is all about?
Correct.
Similarly, my poem to Sylvia Plath,
Mm,
dedicated to Sylvia Plath. Here is a poet, young poet. She belongs to the confessional school of poetry, and she
mm,
tries to commit suicide 3 times, and finally she succeeds. So my
mm-hmm.
poem is that when everything, why did you commit suicide? For Sylvia Plath is the poem. So if you don't
Mm,
know the life of Sylvia Plath, how will
mm.
you appreciate? There's a
Yeah,
poem
that's
on
true.
Hemingway. There's a poem on
Yeah.
Hemingway. Now, if you are not aware of Hemingway's work, his lifestyle, Hemingway's poems is another beautiful poem, I think, which gives us the lust to live.
Mm.
That he had a lust for life, and he was drinking, he was killing lions, he was fighting bull, he was
Oh,
doing bullfighting in Spain. He
wow.
married 4 times. He
Oh my
went to
God.
the war and won a gallantry award. He could drink one
Wow.
bottle of liquor every day. So he had everything and he won the Nobel Prize for
Mm.
literature, doing all those
That's
things.
amazing. Yeah.
And then one day he just comes and kills himself. So all these things disturb why. So my poem on Hemingway
Mm.
uh, is it is not proved, but a lot of his critics feel that he ultimately killed himself because he could not write anymore.
Mm.
the the thing about the writer's block.
Yeah,
In the
writer's
end,
block.
he
Correct.
tried to write, but he could not write. And that
Mm.
was unbearable for him. So,
Mm.
despite all these accolades he won in life, he ultimately takes his life.
Mm. I think he was also the author of the very famous book called "The For Whom the Bell Tolls," right?
For Whom the Bell Tolls is about the
Yeah,
Spanish Civil War. Yes,
yeah.
he's the
Actually,
author of
I've
that.
heard
Yes.
about, yeah, I've heard a lot about
Yeah,
that
it's
book.
one of his
That was
best
one of,
novels. Yeah.
yeah, yes, that's
Yeah,
true.
yeah.
So very well explained, Jax, I must say. You have a very deep knowledge about poetry and even the lives of such great poets. You have so much knowledge in depth. So thank you so much for making us aware of these facts,
So
which we were
another
not.
thing is this, as I said, there are two kinds of poetry, subjective and objective. In the objective poems, your personal feelings are not involved. But
Mm,
in subjective poetry, your personal feelings are involved. Here,
mm,
subjective poetry can also bring about what is known in the literature. This was coined by the Greeks, catharsis.
mm,
Catharsis is that if you are suffering, if you are in pain, if you write a poem, if you write create any art, so the writer undergoes a process of catharsis,
catharsis.
that all
That's
his
right. Yeah.
repressed emotions come
Mm,
out.
mm,
And not only for the writer, but the reader also, when the reader
mm,
reads such work. Similarly, in a play, when you see a play of Shakespeare, most of his tragedies have or Greek theater, for instance, had this thing about catharsis. So I think when you write a poem, a poet writes, he also, if it's subjective poetry, if it's about his personal feelings, there is that process of catharsis that he undergoes.
that's true. One more thing I would love to
Yeah, yeah, sure.
ask you. Yeah, nowadays when I see when I read journals or any magazines, randomly, I don't see that amount of poetry is being published. So what do you think? What is going to be the future of poetry or poets? Because these days these are not being encouraged much in magazines and journals.
So
So.
let me please tell you, this is a very good question, that most of the magazines and even Sunday newspapers have stopped
Mm,
publishing poetry, especially in the
yes.
English language.
Mm,
Like earlier, like I said, Femina was publishing, Illustrated Weekly
yes.
was
Yes.
there, the Youth Times were there. There used to be a magazine called, I think, not Outlook, but Imprint. There was a magazine
Mm,
called Imprint which used to publish poetry. All these are not there. Poetry journals are not there. But what has happened now is that we have what is called the online poetry portals.
mm,
So there are a lot of online poetry portals. Uh, there's a former friend of mine who was in Jaipur, Tulika Alda. In 2017,
mm,
she started A Voice from Far Away, a poetry online portal. And she would always send me a message, Jax, why don't you put your old poems on this, and why don't you start writing again? So it was for her poetry portal that in 2017 I started writing poetry again.
mm,
And so some of the new poems are from that portal. But now there are so many poetry portals where you can share your
mm,
poems. I would like to give you an example of when I wrote a poem on Hemingway. I put it on the online portal of Hemingway, that poem,
mm.
to see the reaction.
Oh,
And there was an
wow.
amazing reaction. There was a fiery debate. While most of the people, appreciated the poem, there were some who also criticized it. And they took out tiny minor mistakes like I've written he married thrice. They
Mm.
said he actually married 4 times. So I said that doesn't take away
Mm.
the essence of the poem. What we are trying to say
Yeah,
is that he lived a full life.
yeah.
So there were, I've written in my poems that his ex-wives were his friends. So someone was disagreeing that they were not his friends really. So all those little, but it started a debate. So
Mm.
within no time, you had 100 comments on my
Wow.
poems. So we can get this is the kind of response you get on online
Mm.
now, which you would never get in a magazine earlier.
That's true. That's true.
So
So,
that is true.
social platforms and digital जो भी platforms introduce हुए हैं इनकी वजह से बहुत ज्यादा एक boost मिलने वाला है आगे going forward ऐसा बोल सकते हैं magazines और journals की जगह पे ये लोग take over कर लेंगे ऐसा आपका मानना है
हाँ बिल्कुल बिल्कुल ऑलरेडी टेक ओवर कर चुके हैं
कर चुके
कर नहीं
हैं so
लेंगे
the
कर चुके हैं
future is bright for the poets I must
या
say
ऑनलाइन बट यू डोंट हैव अ पब्लिश्ड इन हैंड सो पब्लिशिंग में सिर्फ आपको एक किताब छापनी पड़ेगी देयर वोंट बी एनी magazines which are you will be surprised that newspapers have now more or less stopped publishing letters to the editor एक पहले मिडल आता था एडिटोरियल पेज में वो भी बंद कर दिया है सो लॉट ऑफ चेंजेस हैव गॉन उसमें पोइट्री का भी छपना अब कम हो गया
That's great. And thank you so much for such amazing information, Jags. One more thing I would love to add. आप कोई और anthology of poems या कोई next book plan कर रहे हैं in near future? If you love to tell us about that.
Actually, you'll be surprised जो poems मैंने 2020 में लिखी हैं बहुत सारी poems. They are my because we got the time because of the lockdown. और दूसरा I think I've written some of my most matured poetry in this year 2020. उसमें कम से कम 3-4 poems ऐसी हैं जो कोविड पे हैं पैंडेमिक पे हैं you know so and I think I've written so there is no denying that I will be coming out with another volume. I could add both these poems of this year and this together and make a collected edition, or I can come out with the second edition of poetry.
Wow, that's amazing. We'll be looking forward to that actually.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
And one more thing, Jax, our audience would love to know that you are such a successful PR practitioner for so many years, and now we have seen this amazing side of yours, जहां आपने कमाल की ये 46 पोएम्स का कंपाइलेशन किया एक से एक बेहतरीन पोएम्स हैं. So how do you मतलब आप कैसे इसको मैनेज करते हैं फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल दोनों चीजों का बैलेंस, क्योंकि जब हम पूरे दिन काम करके इतनी सारी चीजों के अंदर पूरी तरह एग्जॉस्ट हो जाते हैं तो क्रिएटिविटी जो है कहीं ना कहीं कॉम्प्रोमाइज तो होती है, बट स्टिल यू डू सच फैबुलस जॉब. सो आप क्या हमारे जो यूथ है जो देख रहे हैं इसको उनको कुछ आप टिप देना चाहें इस बारे में जो दो चीजें साथ में बैलेंस कर रहे हैं?
देखिए पोएम्स जो है ना एक यू कांट प्लान. आई कैन प्लान टू राइट अ नॉवल कि मैं सुबह जैसे हेमिंगवे सुबह 6 बजे उठता था और 9 बजे तक लिखता था. You know, most of the writers have a schedule. For writing poetry, you can't have a schedule. It strikes you from nowhere, you know.
Yeah,
so poems you'll be surprised that मेरे बार कई बार अगर रात को नींद खुल गई, suppose I wake up in the night and I can't go back to sleep immediately. I can, you know, feel in my mind that there is a poem developing about something, you know, and most of the times I scribble it if it comes in my mind. I will just read one more poem.
Yeah,
it's called the Eluding Poem. जो मेरे को रात को sometimes in your dreams you can see you know, for a poet you can see the words. If you morning में half of it is gone, but sometimes you remember it fully. But even if the half is there, you can develop it. Yeah. So there is a poem in my thing, the Eluding Poem. ये मेरे को दिख रही है लेकिन वो मेरे हाथ में नहीं आ रही. There's a I think I'll just read this out for you.
Yes, please.
Sorry. Yeah, while I slept, I dreamt of a poem, a well-crafted verse floating past by me. I gently tried to catch it, very much like one tries to catch a flitting butterfly. It deftly evaded me. I tried once again, ever so softly. It eluded me yet again and again. I was now getting desperate. This time I grabbed at it. It smartly moved away once again. I was now getting mad and lunged violently at it. With Catch Me If You Can disdain, It went away just like that. I woke up in cold sweat. So this is a poem about how
Wow,
I'm
amazing.
dreaming that it's a beautiful poem and I'm trying to catch it. And
Yes.
then I suddenly wake up. So some of my poems in this are when you wake up in the middle of the night, rather than getting up and trying to read something, or I start imagining a poem and it works out quite
I
well.
can totally relate to that because being a composer, sometimes I also dream of a composition, a very well-made composition, which never exists in real life. And when I wake up in the morning, it's completely gone. And I
Yeah,
keep
yeah.
on trying to regain that, but it never happens. So that
True.
happens with
And a lot of
every
poets
creative.
have told me this. A lot of poets have
Mm-hmm.
told me that a
Yes.
poem can. One of my aunts was a very well known Punjabi poem, Prabjot Kaur. She used
Mm-hmm.
to tell me that she could dream of a poem with words and commas and full stops, everything,
Wow, wow,
And if
mind
she got
blowing.
up in the night, she would try and remember and write it
Hmm.
down. You talked about in the beginning कि बहुत कम शब्दों में. So there's
जी,
one
जी.
aspect of my poem that I would say is that, as I said, revision is very important.
Hmm.
You know, you try and anything superfluous, एक word भी superfluous होगा, it will disturb the rhythm of a poem. Read out
Yes.
loud. And I have a poem here, इसमें the Holocaust survivor.
Hmm.
Holocaust is what happened in the concentration camps in World War II. So I was
Hmm.
reading an article in which, you know, every year, uh, जब D-Day was the time when World War II में Allied
Yes.
forces had, overtaken, and the concentration camps में Jews were rescued.
Hmm.
So I was reading this thing that every year they bring some 90-year-old person that he was in this concentration camp. They take photographs of his once a year and all. And they made him like a photo opportunity, like journalist photo op कहते हैं
Hmm.
ना वैसे. So I felt
Yes.
ये क्या, and they narrate the same thing what happened in the concentration camps. So what I'm trying to say is that it was a 5 verse, 5 paragraph poem, 5 stanzas were there.
Hmm.
And when I started, it's a good idea to write a poem and forget about it, see it after a few days, then you feel ये तो बहुत क्या क्या लिख दिया है. So ultimately, which was a 5 stanza poem, is now only 1.5 paras or 1.5 stanzas. And if I read
Oh.
the long poem again, and the short
Hmm.
poem has so
A
much
better
more
impact.
impact.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
There is
That's
this
true.
such a short poem, my second poem, Topsy Turvy.
Yeah.
Topsy Turvy is in 8 lines. It says कि हम सब जैसे now like Sitwell's bat,
Hmm.
which is why I said that if you are not aware of other poets, most of the people might not know Sitwell's bat.
Hmm. Hmm.
Edith
Hmm.
Sitwell
Exactly.
is a poet, और Bat series पे उन्होंने एक पोएम लिखी है चमगादड़ के ऊपर. So
Oh.
like Sitwell's bat,
Hmm.
I hung myself upside down, and lo, the world no longer looked upside down. And the jigsaw pieces of life, all of them, fell into their places.
Places. Wow.
So
Beautifully
अभी अपन
expressed.
सब, क्योंकि अपन को समझ नहीं आ रही लाइफ, क्यों नहीं आ रही,
Hmm.
because if we turned our upside down, because things are not right, topsy turvy. That's why they
Correct.
don't fit into the.
And you
Which is
change
why
your
everyone
perception.
keeps asking, जो मेरी
Yeah.
figuring out poem पढ़ी थी, what's it all about?
Hmm.
This is
Hmm. Hmm.
what you can't really figure out what's it all about.
That's true. Once we change our perception, then we can see the things in a different way.
Yeah,
So
in a different
that's all about.
perspective.
Yeah. Amazing. Amazing. Had a great session with you, Jax. It was
Thank you so
actually a
much. Thank
pleasure
you for
having you.
inviting me. Thank
Uh,
you to Whims and Realities. Thank you
Thanks
also
to
to Tanmay
Tanmay, yeah,
Singh for
the whole Whims and
giving
Realities family. And
family.
thanks
Yeah,
to
yeah.
you, Jax, again.
Thank you so much.
Such a wonderful session. Thanks a lot. See you soon again
Thank you
and
all.
take good care.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have a
Bye.